There are big differences between Thermoblock and boiler systems in espresso machines. The Thermoblock is two pieces of metal with a routed channel in them, and they're joined together to form sort of an internal pipe where water can flow through. They have a heating element in one of the sides that's embedded inside it, and a thermostat or sensor. The heating element heats up to about 140 odd degrees. That heats this metal block, and as the cold water comes in and goes down the channel, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually you get hot water coming out that they use to brew coffee. If they want to also use the same Thermoblock for steam to make it even cheaper to make the machine, they put a simple switch in, two thermostats, one low temperature for brewing, one high temperature for when they want to make steam. Gets the block really hot, just keeps the heating elements on for longer. Cold water comes in and it's pulsed this time. The pump doesn't run full power, it normally pulses the water, so you get much less water coming in. And by the time that water gets towards the end of the Thermoblock, it's got hot enough, over 100 degrees, it flashes off into steam, and you actually get steam coming out. The problem with a Thermoblock is the temperature isn't usually very consistent. Even if you use a more expensive temperature controller, you're heating a block of metal in the hope that the water will reach the right temperature. If the rate at which water flows through the coffee changes, or through the Thermoblock changes for any reason, temperature is affected. The slower it moves, it's hotter; the faster it moves, the cooler the water is when it comes out, which gives you a variable brew temperature. If it's used for steam, it gets really, really hot, so you've got to let it cool down before you can brew again, or run some water through if you don't want to wait. The problem with running hot water through is you've got to go back to the brew setting and use it as if you're brewing coffee. Steam pressure isn't very good compared to steam from a proper boiler. The pump's turned right down, it's very little water. The steam doesn't come out with a lot of power. It'll take a long time to heat milk, and if you don't get the right sort of pressure, the longer you take to foam your milk, the more difficult it is to make microfoam. The more the proteins coagulate as well, the less sweet the milk is. It's the cheapest way to heat water, but it certainly is definitely not the best way. Now, a brew boiler is very, very different. In the Minima, the brew boiler is ASI 316L stainless steel. That's pretty much surgical grade, low corrosion. It's got sidewalls 2 mil thick, end plates 8 mil thick where all the fittings go, and it's an 800 mil boiler, which is pretty large. It holds plenty of liquid. That gives you a good amount of mass, thermal mass, to maintain a stable temperature within the boiler. Inside the boiler there's a thermal probe and a PID, a sophisticated electronic device enabling the water to be kept at a very accurate temperature, and more importantly a temperature you can set, be it 91, 92, 93. You've got an inlet pipe where cold water comes in, but also water from the group, as we'll see in a moment, and an outlet pipe where brew water goes to the group at the correct temperature to brew coffee. And lastly, a heating element embedded into the boiler. It's long life Incaloy 800. Now, how the system works, it sends water from the outlet into the group, and there's a chamber in this group inside here. Hot water goes in, it keeps the group hot, and there's 7 pounds of metal in an E61 group, which makes them expensive, and it keeps this group very, very hot. And as that water heats the group, it obviously cools down a bit, so it flows out of another hole in the group, back into the inlet pipe, into the boiler, and that keeps the boiler water always mixing, always moving around. The heating element comes on as it's needed, so it gives a nice even temperature. Water continually flows around this loop, keeping the group nice and hot, and that's what we call a Thermos Siphon. And it's what really makes such a stable brew temperature for making coffee, and that's important. And in this boiler, in the Minima particularly, you'll notice this part of the pipe pokes down into the water about 2.5 to 3 centimeters. This is so that if any air gets in the boiler, here, in the top, if it was just onto a fitting on the boiler, any slight amount of air without this tube poking in would stop the flow or slow down the flow of this Thermos Siphon, and the group would cool and would affect the temperature of the coffee. Many manufacturers, unfortunately, do not project a tube into the boiler. They just finish at the fitting at the top, and there is a risk that those Thermos Siphons can, if the machines are left unattended for a while, develop some air and slow down. What some of the manufacturers do, they actually tilt the boiler at an angle, and if you've ever looked at a picture of a machine and seen the boiler at an angle, that's so that it allows for a little tiny bit of air to get in, but still doesn't expose this end because it's tilted. Just hold a bottle of fizzy drink or a bottle of water and tilt it over and you'll see what I mean. But that's not a great way. The best way is to go to the expense of embedding that tube into the boiler by about 2.5 to 3 centimeters. The Alpha machine didn't have this, but it was something I insisted on the Beta Minimas and what'll be on the production Minimas. The advantage of a boiler is a large mass of water and metal. It's very consistent and very accurate temperature PID control. That metal of the group coupled with the mass of the boiler is a very consistent system. If the rate at which the water flows through this system and through the coffee changes, the temperature just isn't affected. It's completely separate in a dual boiler machine, which the Minima is, to having a service boiler. Brew water from a brew boiler is only used for brewing the coffee. You have a separate service boiler which you use for steam and for hot water, and you can run that at a much higher temperature, much higher pressure. Get plenty of high pressure steam, 4, 5, 6 times more powerful than a Thermoblock. It'll steam the same amount of milk, where a Thermoblock might take 50 or 60 seconds. You can steam it in 15 or 20 seconds. The pressure's so much higher and the speed's so much greater that the milk microfoam's much better and it stays sweeter. Steam pressure is generated by this separate service boiler, and as I said, absolutely fantastic. There's no having to let something cool down. You can steam and brew at the same time, which you can't do in a Thermoblock system unless you've got 2 Thermoblocks. It's the most expensive way to heat water, but it's the best. There is no finer way. It's not cheap, but it is the best way. A Thermoblock is just being cheap.